They said the most dangerous men feared nothing, but sometimes the deepest hunger had nothing to do with food. For nearly 3 years, the private kitchen inside Ethan Park's Hilltop estate had become the most intimidating workplace in New York. Award-winning chefs arrived carrying polished resumes, international trophies, and recipes that had impressed celebrities, presidents, and billionaires alike. Most of them never lasted longer than a week. Some barely survived a single dinner service before quietly packing their knives and leaving through the same iron gates where they had entered with impossible confidence. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the Korean Mafia boss possessed an impossibly refined palate that rejected anything less than perfection. Others insisted he deliberately enjoyed watching talented chefs fail. A few whispered that no meal could ever satisfy him because the standards he demanded simply did not exist. None of them knew the truth. Every evening, precisely at 7 o'clock, Ethan sat alone at an impossibly long walnut dining table beneath warm crystal chandeliers that cast golden reflections across untouched silverware. The room looked less like a place for dinner and more like a museum preserving memories no one was allowed to touch. Staff members moved quietly, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The clock always seemed louder than human voices. Every fork placed on the linen sounded like a confession. Every plate carried the silent hope that tonight might finally be different. It never was. Ethan rarely criticized the meals placed before him. He almost never raised his voice. Instead, he would take one careful bite, pause for several long seconds, lower his polished fork, thank the chef with perfect courtesy, and simply say, "This isn't it." Those 3 words echoed through the mansion more painfully than shouting ever could. By sunrise, another celebrated career had quietly disappeared from the estate forever. His employees believed they worked for a man impossible to please. His closest advisors believed grief had slowly transformed discipline into obsession. Only Ethan himself understood that every dinner had become something far more personal than a meal. Long before wealth, influence, or carefully tailored suits became part of his life, there had been another dining table. Smaller, worn by time, filled with laughter instead of silence. Steam rising from simple homemade dishes drifted through tiny windows while an older woman smiled without ever asking whether the food tasted good. She never needed to ask because she already knew. That kitchen had disappeared many years ago, yet its warmth refused to leave his memory. Every chef hired afterward unknowingly competed against something no restaurant, cookbook, or culinary school could ever reproduce. They were not fighting another cook. They were chasing a memory. Tonight, another celebrated executive chef walked out through the front entrance carrying expensive knives inside an elegant leather case. His shoulders remained straight until the heavy gates slowly closed behind him. Only then did disappointment finally win. Inside the mansion, the staff exchanged exhausted glances without saying a word. Tomorrow another famous name would probably arrive. Tomorrow another masterpiece would almost certainly fail. Somewhere across the city, however, a woman named Naomi Brooks finished her shift inside a modest neighborhood diner where the menu fit on a single laminated page and regular customers greeted each other by first name. She had never attended culinary school. She had never cooked for television cameras or wealthy investors. She measured ingredients by instinct, remembered recipes through stories instead of notebooks, and believed the most important seasoning in any kitchen could never be purchased inside a store. She had absolutely no idea that before another sunset, the loneliest man in New York and the simplest cook he would ever meet were already moving toward the same table, carrying 2 completely different kinds of emptiness that neither of them yet understood. Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that people often underestimated ordinary places. The little diner where she worked sat on a quiet corner between a neighborhood hardware store and a family-owned laundromat in Queens. The sign outside flickered. Whenever heavy rain rolled through, the booths had been repaired more times than anyone could remember, and the coffee mugs never quite matched because replacements came one at a time over many years. Still, every morning before sunrise, regular customers walked through the front door smiling as though they were returning home. Construction workers ordered pancakes before long shifts. Retired couples shared slices of warm apple pie every Thursday afternoon. Police officers stopped by for fresh coffee during overnight patrols. Naomi knew almost every customer by name. not because she had an exceptional memory, but because she genuinely listened whenever someone shared a story. To her, cooking had never been about impressing strangers. It was about remembering that every person carried something heavy they could not always explain. Her grandmother had taught her that lesson in a tiny kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, where fresh biscuits cooled beside open windows and cast-iron pans had been passed down through generations. She never measured flour with expensive scales or timed recipes with digital clocks. She cooked by paying attention. She listened to the sound of onions softening in butter. She recognized when soup needed another few minutes simply by its aroma drifting through the room. She believed recipes were conversations instead of instructions. As a little girl, Naomi had once asked why her grandmother never entered cooking competitions even though everyone in the neighborhood insisted her food was the best they had ever tasted. Her grandmother had smiled while stirring a pot of chicken and vegetable stew and answered with words Naomi never forgot. "Baby, people forget fancy presentations. They remember how you made them feel after the last bite." Years later, those words quietly shaped every meal Naomi prepared. She never imagined they would matter outside that modest diner. On the other side of the city, the atmosphere inside Ethan Park's estate felt unusually tense before lunchtime. Victor Hahn, the estate manager who had faithfully overseen household operations for almost 2 decades, stood in the empty kitchen reviewing another stack of applications. From internationally recognized chefs, their accomplishments blurred together. Michelin stars, television appearances, best-selling cookbooks, luxury restaurants in Paris, Seoul, Tokyo, and Los Angeles. None of it inspired confidence anymore. Every recommendation looked impressive on paper, yet experience had taught Victor that credentials meant very little once dinner reached the dining room upstairs. As he sighed and closed another folder, one of the assistant managers hurried into the kitchen carrying troubling news. The replacement chef scheduled to begin that afternoon had been delayed indefinitely after a family emergency. Several important business guests were expected for dinner the following evening, and there was no one available to take command of the estate kitchen. Silence settled across the room as every staff member silently wondered who would volunteer for an assignment that had become almost legendary for ending careers. At nearly the same moment, the owner of Naomi's Diner answered an unexpected telephone call from an old culinary supplier who occasionally helped private households locate temporary kitchen staff during emergencies. The request sounded almost impossible. A private estate urgently needed someone reliable for one evening. No public interviews. No publicity. Excellent pay. Immediate transportation. Every experienced chef contacted that morning had declined because of scheduling conflicts or personal commitments. The owner laughed softly before glancing toward Naomi, who stood near the grill carefully preparing a simple tomato soup for an elderly customer recovering from surgery. She stirred the pot gently before tasting a single spoonful and adding one final pinch of herbs with complete confidence. "I know someone who is not famous," the owner said into the phone. "But if your client is looking for someone who actually cooks with heart instead of ego, I think I have exactly the right person." Naomi looked up with quiet curiosity, completely unaware that a single conversation taking place across the room was about to redirect the path of her ordinary life toward a future neither success nor failure could have prepared her to imagine. Naomi almost declined before the caller had finished explaining the opportunity. She had covered enough extra shifts over the years to know that last-minute offers usually came with impossible expectations hidden behind generous pay. She glanced around the diner, watching Mr. Alvarez carefully fold his newspaper while finishing the last spoonful of soup she had prepared, and an elderly couple laughing quietly over a shared slice of peach pie. This was the rhythm she understood. Familiar faces, honest conversations, food served without performance. The owner noticed the hesitation in her eyes and lowered his voice. "You have spent years taking care of everyone else. Maybe it is time someone notices what you can really do." Naomi smiled politely, but shook her head. "I am not the person they are looking for. They asked for a chef." The owner leaned against the counter with a knowing expression. "No, they asked for someone who can cook dinner tonight. Those are not always the same thing." An hour later, Naomi found herself sitting in the back seat of a black sedan, traveling through Manhattan as late afternoon sunlight reflected against rows of glass towers. She wore the cleanest white kitchen jacket she owned, although it was noticeably simpler than the uniforms worn by famous executive chefs. Resting on her lap was a weathered leather notebook that had once belonged to her grandmother. Inside were handwritten recipes mixed with small notes about family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, and tiny reminders like, "Always taste before serving," and "People remember comfort longer than perfection." She gently ran her fingertips across the faded pages before closing the notebook with quiet respect. The estate appeared beyond tall iron gates surrounded by carefully trimmed gardens and towering maple trees. Everything about the property communicated discipline, elegance, and silence. A member of the household staff greeted her professionally before escorting her through hallways decorated with paintings, polished wood, and soft golden lighting. No one rushed. No one spoke louder than necessary. It felt less like entering someone's home and more like stepping inside a place where every detail had been rehearsed for years. Victor Hahn was waiting in the kitchen with several members of the culinary staff already standing nearby. His calm expression revealed years of experience managing difficult situations, but Naomi could still recognize the fatigue behind his polite smile. "Miss Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She returned the handshake warmly. "I will do my best." Victor nodded before leading her deeper into the enormous kitchen. Every counter gleamed beneath bright overhead lights. Professional ovens lined one wall, while shelves displayed ingredients imported from around the world. Naomi had never seen such an extraordinary collection of equipment in one place. Yet what immediately caught her attention was not the luxury. It was the uneasy atmosphere. Several kitchen assistants exchanged uncertain glances as they quietly organized ingredients. One whispered to another, believing Naomi could not hear, "She does not even look like an executive chef." Another replied softly, "Maybe she is only here until tomorrow." Naomi pretended not to notice. She had spent enough years being underestimated to understand that defending herself with words rarely changed anyone's opinion. Victor handed her a simple folder containing the evening menu. "There is one important thing you should know," he said carefully. "Mr. Park never requests complicated dishes anymore. Every chef assumes that means the work becomes easier. They are always mistaken." Naomi studied the menu for several moments before quietly asking a question that surprised everyone standing nearby. What meal made him smile the last time anyone remembers? The room became completely still. One assistant slowly looked toward another, but no one answered. Finally, Victor admitted, almost apologetically, "I do not think anyone here has ever asked that question." Naomi closed the folder without another word and slowly walked toward the pantry instead of the expensive specialty ingredients displayed at the center of the room. Her eyes searched shelves filled with ordinary vegetables, fresh herbs, rice, onions, garlic, and simple pantry staples. She smiled gently, almost as though greeting old friends. Behind a second-floor window overlooking the gardens, Ethan stood alone with a cup of untouched tea, absent-mindedly watching the staff prepare for another evening that he fully expected would end exactly like every dinner before it. Neither of them realized that before the first plate ever reached the dining room, something far more important than a recipe had already begun to change. The kitchen settled into a quiet rhythm unlike anything Naomi had expected. No frantic shouting echoed across the polished counters. No one rushed from station to station. Every movement carried careful precision, as though the entire household had learned that unnecessary noise had no place inside these walls. Naomi tied her apron, washed her hands, and slowly arranged a handful of ordinary ingredients on the work table. Fresh chicken, yellow onions, garlic, carrots, celery, rice, a small bundle of scallions, fresh ginger, nothing rare, nothing imported from the other side of the world. One of the assistants glanced at the ingredients and frowned. "That cannot possibly be the full menu." Naomi smiled gently without looking up. "It is enough if every ingredient has a reason for being there." Another assistant opened the refrigerator and quietly placed a tray of expensive specialty items nearby. Black truffles, premium seafood, imported mushrooms, and rare spices worth hundreds of dollars rested beneath the bright kitchen lights. "These were ordered specifically for tonight," he explained. Naomi studied them for a brief moment before politely sliding the tray aside. "Please keep them fresh for another day. I will not need them." Several members of the staff exchanged puzzled expressions. Victor watched silently from across the room, resisting the urge to interfere. Experience had taught him that every accomplished cook followed a process that looked unusual to everyone else. Naomi filled a stock pot with water and placed it over gentle heat before adding vegetables one by one instead of all at once. She paused after each ingredient, allowing the aroma to slowly develop before introducing the next layer of flavor. The rich scent of onions softened into sweetness. Garlic added warmth without overpowering the broth. Ginger brightened the air with quiet freshness. One young kitchen assistant inhaled deeply before whispering, almost to himself, "It smells like someone's home." Naomi heard him and smiled. That is exactly where dinner should begin. Upstairs, Ethan remained inside his study reviewing paperwork that held little interest for him. Business decisions filled every page before him, yet his attention drifted each time the faint aroma from the kitchen reached the hallway outside his office. He closed the folder without realizing it and stood beside the window. The fragrance felt strangely familiar, not because it reminded him of a specific recipe, but because it carried something he had not sensed in years. Patience. No excessive seasoning reached his senses. No overwhelming richness demanded attention. The meal seemed to ask nothing of him. It simply existed. Downstairs, Naomi carefully tasted the broth before adding a pinch of salt. She closed her eyes for only a second, listening instead of thinking. Her grandmother used to say that every pot spoke if someone cared enough to listen. Almost there, Naomi whispered softly. She prepared lightly seasoned chicken, steamed rice, and vegetables cooked just long enough to remain vibrant without losing their natural texture. Finally, she poured the clear broth into a simple white bowl and placed everything onto an elegant serving tray. One assistant stared at the finished meal with visible concern. "That is all," Naomi nodded. Sometimes people are not hungry for more. They are hungry for something real. At exactly 7 o'clock, the dining room doors opened with their usual quiet grace. Victor personally carried the tray toward Ethan's seat while the household staff observed from a respectful distance, silently expecting another familiar disappointment. Ethan thanked Victor with his usual courtesy before lowering his eyes toward the meal. It looked almost impossibly simple against the polished silver and crystal surrounding it. He lifted the spoon slowly, allowing the steam to rise before taking the first careful sip. The room became perfectly still. Even the ticking grandfather clock seemed to disappear. Ethan did not immediately reach for another spoonful. Instead, he lowered the spoon into the bowl and remained motionless, his expression unreadable as memories quietly gathered somewhere behind his calm eyes. Victor felt his heartbeat quicken. The staff exchanged nervous glances without daring to speak. For the first time in years, several seconds passed without Ethan setting his utensils aside or offering the familiar words everyone had come to expect. Instead, he looked toward the doorway leading back to the kitchen and asked in a calm voice that carried through the silent dining room, "Who prepared this meal?" Victor answered without hesitation, "Her name is Naomi Brooks, sir. She was brought in only for this evening." Ethan remained silent for another long moment before lifting the spoon again. He tasted the broth a second time, slower than before, as though he were searching for something hidden beneath its warmth. Around the table, every member of the household staff waited for the familiar verdict that had ended countless careers. Instead, Ethan reached for a small piece of the roasted chicken, then a spoonful of rice, allowing the flavors to come together naturally. He closed his eyes for only a brief second before opening them again, his calm expression carrying something no one in the room had seen in years. It was not excitement. It was recognition. "Bring her here," he said quietly. Downstairs, Naomi had already begun cleaning her station. She believed dinner service was finished and expected to thank everyone politely before returning to the diner the following morning. When Victor entered the kitchen with an unusually thoughtful expression, every assistant immediately stopped working. "Mr. Park would like to meet you," he said. Several employees exchanged stunned glances. Normally, chefs who prepared unsuccessful dinners were never invited into the dining room. They simply received polite thanks before leaving the estate forever. Naomi dried her hands, straightened her apron, and followed Victor through the long hallway without asking why. As she entered the dining room, Ethan stood beside the table rather than remaining seated. The gesture surprised everyone present. He looked at Naomi for several quiet seconds before speaking. Have we met before? Naomi smiled gently and shook her head. No, sir. This is my first time here. Ethan studied her face carefully, almost hoping memory would reveal an answer that logic could not. Finally, he asked the question that had quietly settled in his heart since the first spoonful. Where did you learn to cook? Naomi did not mention famous schools because there were none. She did not mention prestigious restaurants because she had never worked in one. Instead, she answered with complete honesty. My grandmother taught me in her kitchen. She always said that if you truly listened to people, they would eventually tell you what kind of meal they needed. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the bowl still resting on the table. This soup reminds me of someone. Naomi looked at the remaining broth before answering softly. Then perhaps the soup did exactly what it was supposed to do. Her response caught everyone by surprise. She had not claimed credit for extraordinary skill or hidden family secrets. She simply accepted that food sometimes carried memories better than words ever could. Ethan slowly nodded. My mother used to make something very similar when I was a boy. Not identical, but close enough that I remembered her before I remembered myself. The room became completely still. Even Victor looked down, knowing how rarely Ethan spoke about his family. Naomi's expression remained warm but respectful. Good meals have a way of bringing people back to places they thought were gone forever. Ethan looked at the simple dinner once more before quietly asking, Did someone tell you what she used to cook? Naomi shook her head. No one told me anything except that you preferred simple food. Everything else came from paying attention. Ethan frowned with gentle curiosity. Paying attention to what? Naomi answered without hesitation. The house. The silence. The people working in the kitchen. They were afraid of making mistakes, but no one seemed afraid of wasting expensive ingredients. That told me something important. It suggested that what was missing here could not be purchased. So I stopped thinking about what would impress you and started thinking about what might bring someone peace after a very long day. Ethan did not reply immediately. Instead, he looked around the enormous dining room that suddenly felt much larger than before. For years he had searched for perfection in every carefully prepared plate. Yet standing before him was a woman who had ignored perfection completely and somehow discovered the one thing every celebrated chef had overlooked. For the first time in countless evenings, the meal on his table had not demanded admiration. It had quietly offered comfort. And somewhere deep inside a memory he had almost forgotten, something that had remained frozen for years began, ever so slightly, to thaw. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the tall kitchen windows long before the rest of the estate fully awakened. Naomi had expected to return to the diner before breakfast, but Victor met her near the front entrance with an unexpected request. Mr. Park would like you to stay for a few more days, he said. There is no obligation. If you decline, transportation has already been arranged. Naomi paused for a moment. She thought about her co-workers covering her shifts, the familiar comfort of the neighborhood diner, and the strange feeling that this enormous house was carrying a loneliness far heavier than its polished walls revealed. Finally, she smiled softly. I can stay until the weekend if my boss agrees. One phone call later, the arrangement was made. By mid-morning, Naomi was back in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Instead of searching through expensive imported ingredients, she selected fresh eggs, ripe tomatoes, whole grain bread, seasonal fruit, and a small bunch of herbs growing near the back garden. The assistants watched with growing curiosity. Yesterday, they had expected her to fail. Today, they quietly copied the way she organized her station, noticing that she wasted almost nothing and thanked every employee who handed her an ingredient. She learned names instead of titles. She asked one assistant about his young daughter after noticing a family photograph tucked inside his wallet. She complimented another employee for the careful way he sharpened kitchen knives, explaining that every craft deserved respect. The atmosphere slowly shifted. Conversations became a little warmer. Smiles appeared more naturally. For the first time in years, laughter quietly echoed through the kitchen after one of the younger assistants accidentally dropped a wooden spoon, and Naomi laughed before anyone else could feel embarrassed for him. Upstairs, Ethan noticed the difference before he even entered the dining room. The silence that usually surrounded the estate had softened. It was not louder. It simply felt lighter. Breakfast arrived without ceremony, and once again the food appeared almost disarmingly simple. He tasted fresh fruit that actually tasted like summer instead of luxury. Warm toast carried the aroma of real butter instead of elaborate seasoning. Even the scrambled eggs reminded him that ordinary ingredients, treated with patience, could become extraordinary. After breakfast, Ethan surprised Victor by asking if Naomi had a few minutes to spare. Instead of meeting in his office, he invited her to walk through the estate gardens. The late spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers, and birds filled the silence between their footsteps without making it uncomfortable. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Naomi seemed perfectly content allowing quiet to exist. Ethan eventually broke the silence himself. Most people become nervous around me. Naomi looked toward the rows of flowering trees before answering. Sometimes people become nervous because they think they are being judged. Other times they become nervous because they are judging themselves. Ethan considered her words with thoughtful curiosity. And which one do you think happens here? Naomi smiled gently. I think many people arrive believing they had to impress you. They forgot that feeding someone and impressing someone are not always the same thing. Ethan laughed quietly. It was not loud or dramatic, but Victor, watching discreetly from a distance, realized he had not heard that sound in years. They continued walking until they reached a small wooden bench overlooking a peaceful pond. Ethan admitted something he had never shared with anyone outside his closest circle. After my mother passed away, every success seemed strangely empty. I kept believing that if I found the perfect meal again, maybe I could find the feeling that disappeared with her. Naomi listened without interrupting. When he finished speaking, she picked up a small maple leaf that had drifted onto the path and turned it gently between her fingers. Memories are funny, she said. They never return exactly the way we expect. Sometimes they arrive through a conversation. Sometimes through a familiar smell. Sometimes through a bowl of soup. The important thing is not chasing yesterday. It is allowing yesterday to remind us that we can still feel something today. Ethan looked across the calm water, where gentle ripples reflected the morning sun like scattered pieces of glass. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not thinking about tomorrow's meetings or yesterday's regrets. He was simply present, standing beside someone who had never tried to change him, never tried to impress him, and never once treated him as anything other than another human being searching for a little peace. By the fourth day, the entire estate had settled into a rhythm that no one could have imagined only a week earlier. Employees who once hurried through silent hallways now exchanged quiet greetings before beginning their work. The kitchen no longer felt like a place where every mistake carried unbearable weight. Naomi had never asked anyone to change. She simply thanked people, listened carefully, and treated every task as though it mattered. Somehow that simple habit spread from one person to another until even the atmosphere seemed lighter. Not everyone welcomed the change. A few of Ethan's senior advisors watched the growing trust between their employer and the temporary cook with increasing concern. Among them was Daniel Cho, a longtime financial strategist who believed discipline depended upon emotional distance. From his perspective, the estate functioned best when every relationship remained strictly professional. He noticed Ethan lingering longer over breakfast, asking about ingredients, and occasionally walking through the kitchen instead of eating alone behind closed doors. To Daniel, these were not harmless changes. They were distractions. One afternoon, he quietly gathered two other advisors inside a private conference room overlooking the gardens. She has been here less than a week, he said, folding his hands across the polished table. Already the routines of this household are changing. That should concern all of us. One advisor hesitated before answering. She has not asked for money, influence, or special treatment. Daniel nodded slowly. Not yet. Influence rarely announces itself. It grows quietly while everyone mistakes it for kindness. Their conversation ended without agreement, but suspicion had already taken root. Later that evening, as Naomi prepared dinner, she noticed that one of the pantry shelves looked unusually disorganized. Ingredients she had carefully arranged the previous day had been moved. Fresh herbs had disappeared from their usual place. A container of homemade vegetable stock had been replaced with commercially prepared broth that carried a much stronger taste. She paused for a moment, studying the shelves without frustration. Instead of asking who had rearranged them, she quietly began preparing everything again from scratch. One of the younger assistants looked confused. Miss Brooks, the prepared stock is already finished. It will save almost an hour. Naomi smiled gently while washing fresh vegetables. Sometimes saving time costs more than we realize. The assistant nodded thoughtfully and began helping without another question. From across the room, Daniel observed the exchange without revealing himself. He had expected inconvenience to create irritation. Instead, Naomi simply adapted without complaint. The result disappointed him more than he cared to admit. During dinner service, Ethan immediately noticed another familiar warmth in the meal. Nothing appeared dramatic or luxurious, yet every flavor seemed balanced with quiet confidence. After the plates were cleared, he asked Victor an unexpected question. Has anyone seemed unhappy since Naomi arrived? Victor considered the question carefully. Most people seem happier, sir. Ethan looked toward the darkened windows reflecting the dining room lights. Most people, he repeated softly. Victor understood immediately. There are a few who believe change creates uncertainty. Ethan nodded but offered no further comment. The following morning, Naomi stepped outside before sunrise carrying a small basket toward the estate garden. She preferred selecting herbs while the air remained cool because their fragrance seemed brighter at the beginning of the day. As she clipped fresh rosemary and thyme, she noticed Daniel standing nearby with his hands behind his back. Beautiful morning, she said warmly. Daniel returned a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. You seem very comfortable here. Naomi placed another sprig into the basket. Everyone has been very kind. Daniel looked across the quiet garden. Temporary situations have a way of feeling permanent if people are not careful. Naomi understood the meaning beneath his words, yet her expression remained calm. Nothing stays the same forever, she replied. That is what makes kindness worth giving while we have the chance. Daniel searched her face, almost expecting defensiveness or ambition to reveal itself. Instead, he found only quiet sincerity, and somehow that unsettled him even more. As Naomi walked back toward the kitchen, Daniel remained standing among the morning flowers, increasingly convinced that the greatest influence was not built through authority or wealth. It was earned through trust, and that was precisely why he believed someone would eventually have to stop it before the entire household began choosing compassion over fear. The invitation to Friday evening's private dinner arrived with unusual importance. Several longtime business partners and senior advisors would be joining Ethan at the estate, making it the largest gathering since Naomi had first stepped into the kitchen. Every employee understood the evening would quietly shape the future of the household. Daniel understood it as well, and before sunrise, he made a decision that he believed would restore the old order. While the kitchen staff prepared for the busy afternoon, he instructed one employee to replace the fresh vegetable stock Naomi had prepared with a heavily seasoned commercial substitute. He did not intend to harm anyone. His goal was far simpler. If dinner lost the quiet balance Ethan had come to appreciate, he believed disappointment would naturally end Naomi's unexpected influence. By late afternoon, the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of slowly simmering vegetables, fresh herbs, roasted chicken, and warm bread. Naomi moved calmly from station to station, thanking each assistant and encouraging even the newest employees to taste the broth before serving. As she reached for the stock she had prepared earlier that morning, she paused. The color looked darker than she remembered. She lifted a spoon, inhaled carefully, and tasted only a single drop. Her expression remained peaceful, but she immediately recognized that someone had replaced it. Instead of calling attention to the mistake or searching for someone to blame, she quietly poured the entire container into the sink. One assistant looked horrified. That was enough for tonight's dinner. Naomi nodded gently. Then we will make another one. The young assistant glanced nervously at the clock. We only have a little over an hour. Naomi smiled as she reached for fresh vegetables. A hurried meal fills the stomach. A patient meal reaches the heart. We still have enough time. Without another word, the entire kitchen began working together. One employee chopped onions while another washed herbs from the garden. Someone else prepared fresh bread dough, and even Victor rolled up his sleeves to help stir the new broth. No one complained. No one argued. They simply worked side by side with a sense of purpose that had not existed before Naomi arrived. From the hallway, Daniel watched in disbelief. He had expected frustration, accusations, or panic. Instead, his attempt to create division had somehow united everyone even more. As evening settled over the estate, guests gathered around the long dining table beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Conversations drifted easily through the room while the first course was served. Ethan lifted his spoon, tasted the broth, and smiled almost imperceptibly before continuing the meal. One by one, the guests paused to compliment the food, not because it was extravagant, but because every dish felt comforting without sacrificing elegance. One older guest quietly remarked, "This reminds me of Sunday dinners at my parents' house." Another nodded with genuine surprise. "I cannot remember the last time a meal felt this honest." Ethan looked toward the kitchen entrance before setting down his spoon. "The person who prepared tonight's dinner deserves our thanks." Moments later, Naomi entered the dining room, still wearing her simple white kitchen jacket. She looked slightly embarrassed by the attention, folding her hands respectfully as every guest turned toward her. Ethan stood from his chair, an action that immediately drew everyone's attention. "Many people have cooked in this house," he said calmly. "They brought extraordinary skill. Tonight someone brought something rarer." She reminded us that excellence is not measured only by technique. Sometimes it is measured by the care we show one another. The room fell completely silent. Daniel lowered his eyes, suddenly aware that his quiet plan had achieved the opposite of what he intended. Ethan continued, his voice steady but warm. "Beginning today, Naomi Brooks is not a temporary guest in this household. She is welcome here for as long as she wishes to stay." No applause filled the room. No dramatic celebration followed. Instead, something far more meaningful happened. Every member of the household staff smiled with unmistakable relief, because they understood that the decision had not simply recognized one remarkable cook. It had quietly changed the kind of home this estate was becoming. And for the first time in many years, respect had become more powerful than fear. Weeks slowly turned into months, and the changes inside Ethan Park's estate became impossible to ignore. Visitors who had once described the mansion as impressive but emotionally distant now noticed something entirely different the moment they stepped through the front doors. Fresh flowers appeared more often in the hallways. The kitchen windows remained open whenever the weather allowed, carrying the comforting aroma of homemade bread and simmering soup into rooms that had once felt silent despite their luxury. Employees no longer measured each day by the mistakes they hoped to avoid. Instead, they took quiet pride in small acts of care that gradually transformed the atmosphere around them. Naomi never tried to become the center of attention. She continued wearing the same simple kitchen jacket, arriving before sunrise, greeting every employee by name, and preparing meals with the same patience she had practiced in the neighborhood diner. Whenever someone praised her cooking, she smiled politely and reminded them that every wonderful meal belonged to everyone who helped prepare it. The assistants who had once doubted her now found themselves teaching new employees the habits they had learned from her. Taste before serving. Waste as little as possible. Listen before speaking. Remember that every plate reached a person, not just a customer. Ethan quietly watched these changes unfold without attempting to control them. One afternoon, he stood in the kitchen doorway while the staff laughed together over a recipe that needed one final adjustment. Months earlier, no one would have dared laugh while he was present. Now they greeted him naturally before returning to their work. He realized something remarkable had happened. Respect had replaced fear without anyone announcing a new rule. Later that evening, Ethan invited Naomi to join him for tea in the garden overlooking the small pond where they had first shared an honest conversation. Autumn leaves drifted gently across the water, painting the surface with shades of gold and crimson. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Ethan finally broke the quiet. "I spent years believing I was searching for the perfect meal," he said thoughtfully. "Now I understand that I was searching for permission to feel at home again." Naomi looked across the pond before answering with her usual gentle honesty. "Home is rarely a place. Most of the time it is the people who make us feel safe enough to be ourselves." Ethan smiled, not because the words solved every sorrow he had carried, but because they felt undeniably true. Before leaving the garden, he handed Naomi a small wooden recipe box that had belonged to his mother. It had been carefully restored, though the edges still carried the gentle marks of time. "I kept this hidden for years because I thought protecting it meant never opening it again," he admitted. "Now I think she would have wanted someone to keep adding new memories instead of preserving old ones." Naomi accepted the gift with quiet gratitude, running her hand lightly across the smooth wood before closing the lid again. Then we will make sure it never sits empty. As winter approached, the estate hosted its annual holiday dinner for employees and their families, a tradition that had once been formal and reserved. This year, children laughed while decorating cookies beside seasoned kitchen staff. Retired employees returned to visit. Long dining tables filled with homemade dishes stretched across the great hall, and for the first time anyone could remember, Ethan insisted that everyone eat together instead of separating management from staff. Looking around the room, Victor realized that the greatest transformation had never been about recipes, expensive ingredients, or remarkable culinary skill. One person's quiet compassion had reminded an entire household that dignity could be shared, that kindness could become contagious, and that genuine leadership often began with the smallest acts of respect. As the evening came to an end and warm lights reflected softly across smiling faces, Ethan looked toward Naomi with sincere gratitude. Neither of them spoke another word because none was necessary. The answer he had searched for through countless perfect dinners had never been hidden inside extraordinary food. It had always been waiting inside ordinary kindness, freely given without expecting anything in return. And on that quiet winter night, everyone gathered beneath that roof remembered what true dignity looked like.